So my name is Dr. Gina Riley. I am an associate professor of special education at CUNY Hunter College. Um, I also teach and research unschooling. I have been in the field for now over 30 years. I unschooled my son from birth to his first day of college. He is now an incredible human being with a master's degree and a full-time job in publishing and a side gig in classical guitar teaching. Um, but I've really came to the field of unschooling through intrinsic motivation and self-determination theory. So that's a little bit about me.
We'll come back to the intrinsic motivation piece in just a minute because I think it's such an important aspect of all of this that you know more about than anybody else does. But 30 years ish, long time to be looking at a particular field and form of education. What's changed the most in the time that you've been tracking all of this?
Yeah, I think just the acceptance, right? So post-COVID, all of a sudden, more untraditional forms of learning, including homeschooling, including unschooling, became more acceptable because we all unschooled in those first 2 weeks after COVID, right? No one had curriculum ready, no one had online schooling ready. And so we all really, in those first 2 weeks, unschooled ourselves. Some did really cool things, right? That's where the new hobbies were born. That's where spending more time with family were born. That's where location flexibility also came into play. So prior to COVID, you did hear about homeschooling, but minimal. We didn't even really call it unschooling. I mean, you heard about it a little bit, but no one really knew what it was. Suddenly, after COVID, people started experimenting with more untraditional types of education, and you saw this real increase in the acceptableness of families choosing to homeschool or unschool. You also saw it in language, where when you would say you were homeschooling or unschooling, people wouldn't be like, oh my goodness, right? They kind of knew what that was because at some point, most of the world was homeschooling for at least some of COVID. Of course, COVID was emergency homeschooling. It's a different form of homeschooling. But people did get a taste. And so after that, things have really shifted and changed, especially in terms of acceptance.
So let's come back to intrinsic motivation a little bit. One of the things that I've discovered in working on the book is that young people who have come through unconventional education seem to be a little bit better prepared for college, career, the future, whatever we know of what it's going to be like. And I know you've been thinking about this in a very deep and kind of scholarly way. Could you talk a little bit about where you see that overlap is between intrinsic motivation and what I might call unconventional education writ large?
Yeah, I mean, intrinsic motivation really, and I always use Edward DC and Richard Ryan's definition of intrinsic motivation from self-determination theory. Intrinsic motivation is really joy and love of doing whatever it is that you're doing, right? Of learning, of life, of anything that you really choose. When people unschool, they generally tend to go toward what they love. They generally tend to want to learn more about it, want to be seeped in it, want to do it as much as possible. And so I've always said that really a core tenet of unschooling is intrinsically motivated learning. You don't just see it in unschooling, you see it in schools as well. I think traditional public schools and private schools and charter schools are moving toward, and we see them moving toward a more intrinsic motivation-based focus, a more focus on self-determined learning, and that's always great news. But unschooling is really where you see the most intrinsically based learning, where kids are doing whatever they really feel interested in doing, whatever they want to do for most of their day. And there's also like a form of authentic assessment that is really intrinsic to intrinsically motivated learning, where students will challenge themselves, where they will, think about like more difficult, if it's skateboarding tricks to do, or if it's, musical instrument playing, more difficult pieces, or if it's art, how do they level up? Or if it's any academic subject, how do they do more and how do they level up and how do they see themselves as they're challenging themselves? So I think the fear with unschooling is always that kids don't challenge themselves. And I would say the opposite. Probably the most authentic form of assessment you get is within unschooling and intrinsically motivated learning, because that's when kids are really choosing how to assess themselves.
I wonder if you could say a little bit about how that translates into the adult world. Once young people have gone through whatever form of schooling they go through, is that a skill that stays with you or a way of going about things? And if so, how does that play out in things like college and career?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, from what we know on our research on young adult unschoolers, that Peter Gray and I did in 2015, from what we know just generally across the board, unschoolers are really seeped in the real world. And that integration into the real world for a specific period of time, or maybe for their whole academic life, does bleed through, right? They know how the adult world works. They know how to create a schedule. They know how to plan their day. They know how to time manage. And so there are things that unschooling really intrinsically gives a person that does bleed into their college and career. I remember one of our participants in our 2015 Unschooled Adult Study stated that, unschooling was a lot like college. They get to they chose the classes that they took and they made the schedules that they wanted to make. And they really lived their life surrounded by their own intrinsic interests, their own self-determined way. And so it was very much like the real world. I think also like the rumor or the stereotype of homeschooling and unschooling is that people are sheltered. And I think actually it's the opposite that happens, right? The unschooled student or the homeschool student, for better or for worse, are more really integrated into everyday real life. They understand economic systems very well because they've seen their parents or their family or their guardian budget either really thrive with money or struggle with money. They know, the world of healthcare well because they live it. They know the world of, like decision making well because they do it often. So again, that's one of those stereotypes that like exist where homeschoolers and unschoolers are shielded from the world. And I actually think it's quite the opposite. I actually think they get, how to live in the real world 101 from a very young age.
So let's talk about a little bit about where all this is going. I'd love for you to like dust off your crystal ball and think about, if you could imagine 10 years from now or 20 years from now, what does all this look like? Will it be different or are we just seeing really more of the same?
Yeah, so from my crystal ball, right? What I'm really seeing, both in traditional education and the field of unschooling and homeschooling and alternative education, is they're learning from one another, which is really so exciting to see, right? Unschoolers are learning from more traditional education. See a lot more unschoolers enrolling themselves in classes, enrolling themselves in really goal-based things that they do every day. And then you see traditional schools really think more about intrinsically motivated learning, really think more about things like decision making, social emotional learning, self-determination, all of those things, that were considered soft skills, but are now like really, really important skills. And so I love the fact that they're learning from one another, and I love the fact that they're integrated into one another now.